There's a country on this planet that should not exist, not because it lacks legitimacy in the eyes of its people, but because, by every law of history, every rule of geography, and every calculation of power, its creation was statistically, politically, and militarily impossible. A people scattered across the entire world for 2,000 years. No army, no land, no government, no passport. And yet they came back. They built a nation. And within 11 minutes of declaring independence, the most powerful country on earth recognized them. This is not a coincidence. This is the most calculated geopolitical operation in human history. 2,000 years ago, there was no Israel. There was no Jewish state, no Jewish army, and no Jewish political power anywhere on the face of this earth. What existed instead was a community of people, deeply religious, intellectually driven, and completely at the mercy of whoever held military dominance over the land they called home. That land was called Canaan, later known as Palestine, and even later, it would become the most contested piece of real estate in the history of human civilization. But before we get to that, we need to go back to the very beginning, because the story of Israel does not start in 1948. It does not start in World War II. It does not even start with the Zionist movement of the 19th century. It starts 2,000 years ago with a Roman Empire that wanted complete control, a Jewish population that wanted liberation, and a single man whose arrival changed the religious trajectory of the entire world. When the Roman Empire dominated the ancient world, Palestine was just another province on their conquest list. But for the Jewish people living there, it was everything. It was the land promised to them by God. It was the location of their holiest site, the Second Temple in Jerusalem. It was the center of their identity, their law, and their entire spiritual existence. And yet, under Roman rule, they had none of the power that should come with being the indigenous population of a land. Roman governors taxed them into poverty. Roman soldiers reminded them daily of their subordination. And the Jewish scholarly class, the rabbis and religious authorities, who held enormous influence within their own community, were growing increasingly frustrated, watching their people suffer under foreign domination. Within Jewish theological tradition, there had long been a prophecy. A Messiah would come. A savior who would arrive at the moment of maximum suffering and lead the Jewish people out of oppression, just as Moses had once led them out of Egypt. And as Roman brutality increased, Jewish scholars began looking at the signs and saying quietly among themselves, the time is near. What they expected was a warrior king. What they expected was someone who would arrive, acknowledge their religious authority, validate their scholarship, and then lead a military revolution against Rome. That is not what happened. What happened instead was that a man arrived from Nazareth who had no interest in validating the religious establishment. He gathered crowds not in temples, but in open fields. He did not praise the scholars, he publicly challenged them. He told ordinary people that the religious elite had corrupted the faith, that they had turned spirituality into a power structure, and that God's law was being used as a tool of control rather than liberation. This was not what the Jewish establishment wanted to hear. And so, the very scholars who had been waiting for a Messiah became the fiercest opponents of the man many believed to be exactly that. They went to the Roman governor with a demand to execute this man before his influence grows beyond control. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was reluctant, but the pressure was relentless, and so the order was given. And before the execution, there's a recorded moment that would echo across 2,000 years of history. The Jewish leadership said publicly that the blood of this man would be on them and on their children. That statement, whether literal or metaphorical, became the theological justification for one of the longest and most brutal patterns of persecution in human history. And here is where it gets deeply complicated, because the people who would eventually persecute Jews the most severely were not Romans. They were Christians. After the departure of Jesus, peace be upon him, the Jewish people did not find peace in Palestine. Within a few decades, tensions between the Jewish population and the Roman Empire exploded into full-scale war. The Romans crushed the Jewish revolt with devastating force. In 70 AD, they destroyed the Second Temple, the holiest structure in all of Judaism, and expelled the Jewish people from Palestine entirely. 700,000 Jews were killed or enslaved. The rest were scattered across the Roman world. This event is called the Jewish diaspora, and it created a problem that would take 2,000 years to fully resolve. An entire people, deeply connected to a specific land, now living everywhere except that land. But here is what most people miss about the next 500 years. The Jewish people did not disappear. They did not assimilate into extinction. They carried their identity with them across the known world, maintaining their language, their scripture, their laws, and their burning desire to one day return to Jerusalem. And while Europe and the Mediterranean were absorbed into the growing power of the Roman Christian world, something new was rising in the Arabian Peninsula. In the 7th century, the Islamic Caliphate emerged from Medina and began expanding at a pace that shocked the ancient world. Within decades, Muslim armies had reached Persia, North Africa, and the Levant. And in 638 AD, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab entered Jerusalem not as a conqueror burning the city, but as a ruler who immediately guaranteed the protection of every religious site within it. Here is the detail that changes everything. When the Christian authorities of Jerusalem surrendered the city to Umar, they placed one specific condition on the agreement: no Jews should be allowed to return. Think about what that tells you. Even in their moment of defeat, the Christians of Jerusalem were more concerned about keeping Jews out than about their own fate as a conquered people. Umar rejected this condition. He allowed Jewish families to return to Jerusalem for the first time in over 500 years. And what followed was 4 centuries of remarkable coexistence. Jews and Muslims living together across the Islamic world, in Palestine, in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba. While European Jews were being persecuted by Christian authorities, Jewish communities under Islamic governance were thriving intellectually, commercially, and culturally. Then came the Crusades. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd in Clermont, France, and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in human history. He told European Christians that the Holy Land had been defiled by Muslim rule. He told them that liberating Jerusalem was not just a military mission, it was a divine obligation. He promised that anyone who died in this holy war would have all their sins forgiven. And the response was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Hundreds of thousands of people, knights, peasants, priests, merchants, picked up weapons and began marching east under the banner of the cross. The First Crusade was not just a military campaign. It was a mass religious mobilization, fueled by centuries of theological tension and the very specific belief that Jerusalem belonged to Christianity. The Muslim rulers of the time were completely unprepared, not because they lacked military capability, but because they were distracted by internal conflicts, competing dynasties, personal rivalries between rulers, and the kind of political fragmentation that always precedes a catastrophic defeat. The Crusaders moved through the Middle East and reached Jerusalem in 1099. What happened next was described by witnesses on all sides as one of the most brutal massacres of the medieval world. Muslim men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets. Jewish families who had been living peacefully in Jerusalem under Muslim protection fled to their synagogues and locked the doors. The Crusaders set those buildings on fire and burned them alive. Thousands of Jewish people died not as enemies of the Crusaders, but simply because they were not Christian. This went on for 90 years. 90 years during which Muslim rulers tried and failed to retake Palestine, and during which the Jewish people learned a lesson they would never forget, that their safety under Christian rule was never guaranteed, no matter how peaceful their coexistence appeared on the surface. The liberation of Jerusalem finally came through one of the most celebrated military commanders in Islamic history, Salahuddin Ayyubi, known in the West as Saladin. He united the fragmented Muslim world, built a coalition army, and in 1187 AD retook Jerusalem from the Crusaders. What is remarkable about this moment, and what most mainstream narratives completely ignore, is that during Salahuddin's campaign, the most prominent Jewish scholar of the medieval world, Maimonides, considered the greatest Jewish philosopher and physician of his era, was personally aligned with Salahuddin. He served as his personal physician. Jewish communities across the region supported the Muslim campaign because they understood instinctively what the alternative meant for them. After Salahuddin's victory, the pattern reestablished itself. Jews and Muslims living in relative peace across the Islamic world, while Jewish communities in Christian Europe continued to face periodic violence, forced conversions, and expulsion. The most powerful Jewish communities in the world at this point were not in Palestine. They were in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. For 800 years, Spain under Islamic governance had been the most intellectually and commercially advanced region in the Western world. Jewish scholars, Muslim philosophers, and Arab scientists worked side by side in a civilization that produced advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and architecture that would eventually fuel the European Renaissance. And then, in 1492, it ended. The same year Christopher Columbus sailed west and accidentally changed the entire map of human civilization, the Christian monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista, the military recapture of Spain from Muslim rule. Their immediate announcement was simple and brutal. Everyone in Spain must convert to Christianity or leave. Muslims and Jews faced the same choice: abandon your faith or abandon your home. Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II, understanding exactly what was happening, sent his fleet to the Spanish coast and officially invited the expelled Jews and Muslims to come to the Ottoman Empire, where they would be protected. He reportedly said that the Spanish king must be a fool to expel the most educated and productive population in his kingdom and send them directly to enrich his rivals. And that is exactly what happened. But here is where the trajectory splits, because the Jews who went to the Ottoman Empire remained connected to Islamic civilization, and the Jews who gradually over the following centuries began migrating toward Western Europe entered a completely different world, one where Christian hostility toward them was embedded in law, in culture, and in theology. European Christians passed regulations preventing Jews from owning land. They barred Jews from holding political office or serving in armies. They restricted Jewish participation in most traditional professions. What was left? Trade and finance. And this restriction, intended to limit Jewish power, accidentally created the most financially sophisticated community in European history, because Christians were spending all their available capital buying land, and land is illiquid. It cannot be quickly converted to cash. Jewish families, unable to buy land, kept their wealth liquid. And when European kings needed to finance wars, build infrastructure, or simply survive a bad harvest, they turned to Jewish lenders. The Torah prohibits charging interest to fellow Jews, but permits commercial lending to non-Jews. And so began a financial relationship that would define European economics for centuries. Jewish banking families became the creditors of kings, emperors, and eventually entire empires. William Shakespeare wrote about this dynamic in the 16th century, depicting Jewish moneylenders as central figures in Venetian commercial life, which, while often portrayed with negative stereotyping, accurately reflected the economic reality of the era. The peak of this financial power came through one family. Meyer Amschel Rothschild, born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1744, built what became the first truly international banking network in human history. He sent each of his 5 sons to a different European capital, Frankfurt, London, Paris, Naples, Vienna, with instructions to establish the dominant financial institution in each city. The genius of this design was not just the geographic spread, it was the information network that came with it. In an era before telegraphs or telephones, the Rothschilds had private courier networks that moved information across Europe faster than any government could. They knew the outcome of battles before the governments involved knew. They knew about treaties before they were announced. They knew about crop failures before markets adjusted. This information advantage, combined with their financial resources, made them indispensable to every major European power. During the Napoleonic Wars, the pivotal conflict that would define European power structures for the next century, the Rothschild family made a strategic decision that demonstrated just how much influence they had accumulated. Napoleon Bonaparte was sweeping across Europe with an army that seemed unstoppable, but the Rothschilds chose to finance the British side of the conflict. Not because they had a personal grudge against Napoleon, in fact. Napoleon had been relatively tolerant of Jewish communities compared to many European rulers before him. The decision was strategic. British naval power controlled global trade. A British victory would create a more stable, commercially predictable world for international banking. And with Rothschild financial support flowing to the British war effort, Napoleon was ultimately defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the undisputed global superpower, with the Rothschild banking network as its most important financial partner. Now here is where the story becomes directly relevant to Israel, with Jewish communities sitting at the top of European financial, intellectual, and commercial life. A new idea began circulating quietly. If Jewish power could finance empires, why could it not finance a return to the Jewish homeland? The dispersion had lasted 2,000 years. The humiliation had continued long enough. And now, for the first time in history, Jews had the financial resources and the global connections to do something about it. This was the birth of political Zionism. But it did not emerge publicly all at once. It began quietly with a few thousand Jewish families purchasing land in Palestine, paying double and triple market price for barren, uncultivated territory that Arab landowners were happy to sell. They were not buying the populated, developed areas of Palestine. They were buying empty desert. They were buying swamps. They were buying land that nobody thought had any value. One of the most significant early purchases was a barren stretch of coastline called Ahuzat Bayit. Today, that empty patch of sand is called Tel Aviv, one of the most technologically advanced cities on the planet, home to more tech startups per capita than almost anywhere in the world outside Silicon Valley. As Jewish immigration to Palestine grew slowly through the late 19th century, something remarkable happened culturally. Hebrew, a language that had not been spoken as a daily vernacular for 2,000 years, was being revived. Newspapers were printed in Hebrew, schools were teaching in Hebrew, radio broadcasts were conducted in Hebrew, an entire civilization was being reconstructed from historical memory. And then, in 1897, the quiet operation went public. In Basel, Switzerland, a man named Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress. Herzl was not a religious man. He was a journalist, an intellectual, and a political visionary who had watched the Dreyfus affair in France, where a Jewish military officer was falsely convicted of treason purely because of his religion, and concluded that Jewish assimilation into European society was simply never going to work. No matter how educated, how successful, how culturally integrated Jewish people became, they would always be targets. The only solution, Herzl argued, was a Jewish state. Standing before delegates from across the world, Herzl said something that most people laughed at. He said that within 50 years, the Jewish people would have their own country in Palestine. At that moment, this was considered an almost delusional statement. Palestine was governed by the Ottoman Empire, which had no intention of giving up any territory. The Jewish population in Palestine was approximately 5% of the total. And the international community had no framework or precedent for creating states based on religious identity and historical connection to land. But Herzl was not making a prediction based on wishful thinking. He was announcing a timeline for a plan that was already in motion. And exactly 50 years later, to a degree of precision that remains historically remarkable, the State of Israel was declared. Before that declaration came, Herzl personally traveled to meet Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II. The offer he brought was financially extraordinary. The Zionist movement would pay off the Ottoman Empire's considerable foreign debt in exchange for permission to establish a Jewish settlement in Palestine. Abdulhamid II refused without hesitation. His response, as recorded by multiple historical sources, was unambiguous. He said that even if his body were cut to pieces, he would not give up Palestine. He understood precisely what the establishment of a Jewish settlement under Zionist political organization would eventually mean for Ottoman territorial integrity. He was right, but his refusal did not stop the Zionist movement. It simply redirected it. The Zionists went to their most powerful ally, the British Empire. Britain initially offered alternative locations. Uganda was proposed. Argentina was considered. The Zionist leadership rejected every alternative with equal firmness. Palestine was not negotiable, not because of politics, not because of strategy, but because of 2,000 years of prayer, memory, and identity. Every Jewish religious service for 2 millennia had ended with the same phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." You cannot redirect that kind of longing to Uganda. And so Britain and the Zionist movement waited for the right moment. That moment arrived in 1914, when the assassination of an Austrian archduke triggered the First World War. The Ottoman Empire made the catastrophic strategic decision to align with Germany in World War I. This placed them directly against Britain and France, and it gave the Zionist movement exactly the opening they needed. The Rothschild banking network once again financed the British war effort. And in 1917, before the war was even over, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Walter Rothschild, the leader of the British Jewish community and the most prominent Zionist in Britain, formally declaring that the British government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This was the Balfour Declaration, and it was one of the most consequential diplomatic documents of the 20th century. A global superpower had officially endorsed the Zionist project. Balfour himself was a devout Christian who had been deeply influenced by evangelical theology, the belief that the return of Jews to Palestine was a biblical prerequisite for the second coming of Jesus Christ. This connection between American and British evangelical Christianity and political Zionism is something mainstream analysis consistently underestimates. World War I ended with the Ottoman Empire completely dismantled. Palestine came under British mandatory control. Jewish immigration increased steadily. But here's the problem that Zionist leadership immediately recognized. Even with British support and rapidly increasing immigration, Jews were still a significant minority in Palestine. At the end of World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine was approximately 10%. The Arab Muslim population was 90%. Building a Jewish state on land where 90% of the population was not Jewish was going to require either a dramatic demographic shift or a political framework imposed by international authority. Both of these things were coming. In Germany, something was brewing that would accelerate Jewish immigration to Palestine in ways that no Zionist strategist could have engineered deliberately. The German public had emerged from World War I humiliated, economically devastated, and looking for explanations for their defeat. Into this environment of national humiliation and economic desperation came Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not the first German politician to scapegoat Jewish communities for Germany's problems, but he was by far the most effective at it. He was a communicator of extraordinary power. His speeches did not just persuade people, they transformed them. He told Germans that they had not been defeated militarily. They had been stabbed in the back by internal traitors specifically, by Jewish financiers who had switched their financial support from Germany to the Allied powers during the war. This was a direct reference to the Rothschild decision to support Britain over Germany. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 immediately triggered a systematic campaign against Jewish life in Germany. Jewish businesses were boycotted and eventually forcibly closed. Jewish professionals were stripped of their licenses. Jewish children were expelled from schools. And then the violence began. Kristallnacht in 1938, the Night of Broken Glass, saw thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues across Germany destroyed in a single night of coordinated attacks. As the Nazi military machines swept across Europe during World War II, the the systematic persecution of Jews transformed into something for which human language still struggles to find adequate words. 6 million Jewish people were murdered in what became known as the Holocaust, the most meticulously documented genocide in human history. And as this horror unfolded, Jewish refugees attempted to flee to Palestine in enormous numbers. The Rothschild network and various Zionist organizations actively facilitated this movement. By the end of World War II, the Jewish population in Palestine had risen from 10% to over 30%. Britain, having won World War II, emerged from the conflict financially broken and politically exhausted. The empire that had once controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface was beginning to dissolve. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947. Other colonies followed. Palestine became a problem Britain could no longer manage. Jewish paramilitary organizations, most notably the Irgun and the Haganah, were conducting guerrilla operations against British forces, demanding independence. Arab Palestinian leadership was simultaneously resisting any partition of the land. Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations and essentially said, "You decide." The United Nations partition plan of 1947 was, depending on your perspective, either a reasonable compromise or one of the most consequential injustices of the modern era. The plan divided Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jewish state received approximately 56% of the land, despite Jews comprising roughly 33% of the population. The Arab state received the remainder. Jerusalem was to become an international city under UN administration. Jewish leadership, represented by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan. Palestinian Arab leadership, represented by the Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini, a deeply controversial figure who had met personally with Hitler during the war and attempted to build Muslim military units for the Nazi cause, rejected it completely. And the moment they rejected it, Ben-Gurion made a decision that reshaped the entire region. He declared that since the Arab leadership had refused the partition, the Jewish state would not be limited to the territory allocated by the UN. They would take everything they could hold militarily. On May 14, 1948, standing beneath a large portrait of Theodor Herzl, exactly 50 years after Herzl had made his prediction, in Basel, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. The declaration was made at 4 p.m. At 4:11 p.m., 11 minutes later, United States President Harry Truman officially recognized the new state. The speed of that recognition was not accidental. It reflected decades of Zionist political work within the United States, the enormous influence of the evangelical Christian community that believed a Jewish Israel was a biblical necessity, and the post-Holocaust moral urgency that made opposing a Jewish homeland politically and ethically untenable in the American political environment. The Arab world's response was immediate. Within 24 hours of Israel's declaration of independence, 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded. What followed is called Israel's War of Independence by Israelis and the Nakba, the catastrophe, by Palestinians. The Arab coalition, despite its numerical superiority, was poorly coordinated, inadequately supplied, and operating with incompatible military doctrines. Israel, despite being vastly outnumbered on paper, was fighting with the focused intensity of a people who understood that this was genuinely an existential war. With covert military supplies from Czechoslovakia, political support from the United States, and an army that had been training and organizing for years under the British mandatory framework, Israel defeated all 5 Arab armies and ended the war with more territory than the UN partition plan had allocated. The territory designated for the Arab-Palestinian state was divided. Egypt took Gaza, Jordan took the West Bank. An independent Palestinian state never materialized. But the military victory was only one dimension of what happened in 1948. The other dimension, the one that continues to define the conflict to this day, was the demographic transformation that accompanied the war. Before the conflict began, Palestinian Arabs outnumbered Jewish Israelis by approximately 2-1 across the territory. For Israel to function as a Jewish majority state, this ratio had to change, and it did. Over the course of 1948, approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. Israeli military operations targeted Arab population centers. Over 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated and destroyed. The methods used remain disputed by historians. Some villages were evacuated voluntarily during the chaos of war. Others were cleared by Israeli military force, and documented cases exist of deliberate massacres, including the village of Deir Yassin, where over 100 Palestinian civilians were killed by Irgun fighters in April 1948. Into the homes, vacated by Palestinian Arabs, came approximately 700,000 Jewish immigrants from across the world, survivors of the Holocaust from Europe, Jewish communities expelled from Arab countries after Israel's creation, and Zionist settlers who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Palestinian refugees were placed in camps across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and the remaining Palestinian territories camps that were supposed to be temporary and that, more than 75 years later, still exist. The Palestinian right of return, the demand that these refugees and their descendants be allowed to return to their original homes, remains one of the central and most intractable demands of the Palestinian national movement. Israel has consistently refused to allow this return, understanding that permitting 5 to 6 million Palestinian descendants to return to Israeli territory would fundamentally alter the demographic balance that makes Israel a Jewish majority state. What happened in 1948 was not a random event. It was not chaos. It was not an accident of war. It was the endpoint of a strategy that had been deliberately constructed over more than a century through financial power, diplomatic maneuvering, ideological persuasion, military organization, and the exploitation of 2 world wars to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and position the British Empire as the midwife of a Jewish state. The Zionist movement identified the problem in the 1890s, built the financial infrastructure through the Rothschild network, cultivated the British alliance, leveraged evangelical Christian theology in America to build public support, survived the Holocaust, and ultimately forced the international community to create the political framework that made statehood possible. And here's the thing that most people watching the current conflict in Gaza or the West Bank completely fail to understand. The creation of Israel was not the end of this strategy. It was just the first phase of it. Every military conflict since 1948, the 1956 Suez Crisis, the 1967 Six-Day War, which gave Israel control of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Lebanon invasions, and the repeated military campaigns in Gaza has followed the same basic pattern. Each conflict expands Israeli territorial control, reduces the Palestinian population in contested areas, and creates new facts on the ground that make the prospect of an independent Palestinian state less viable than it was before. The settlements that Israel has built across the West Bank, declared illegal under international law by the International Court of Justice and condemned by virtually every country on earth except Israel and the United States, are now home to over 700,000 Israeli settlers. These settlements are not random. They are strategically placed to fragment Palestinian territory, control water resources, dominate high ground, and make the physical contiguity of a future Palestinian state mathematically impossible. This is not chaos. This is engineering. And it has been extraordinarily effective. The United States' relationship with Israel, the relationship that opened this story, is now one of the most studied and debated alliances in modern geopolitics. Since Israel's founding, the United States has provided Israel with over $300 billion in military and economic aid, adjusted for inflation, making Israel the largest cumulative recipient of American foreign assistance in history. The United States has used its United Nations Security Council veto to block over 40 resolutions critical of Israeli actions. American weapon systems, F-35 fighter jets, precision-guided munitions, missile defense technology form the backbone of Israeli military capability. And yet this relationship is not simply about strategic interests or Cold War positioning or oil politics. At its core, it is driven by the same theological conviction that made Arthur Balfour write his 1917 letter. 70 million American evangelical Christians, representing the single most powerful voting bloc in Republican Party politics, believe that supporting Israel is a biblical obligation. They believe that the fullness of God's plan for humanity requires a Jewish state in control of Jerusalem. And this belief translates directly into American foreign policy in ways that no amount of international pressure has been able to override. The birth of Israel is therefore not simply a story about one country or one people. It is a story about how history is made, not by accident, not by divine intervention alone, but by people with a vision, a strategy, a timeline, and the financial and political resources to pursue that vision across generations. Theodor Herzl stood in Basel in 1897 and announced a 50-year plan. And 50 years later, to the month, it was complete. That level of historical precision does not happen by accident. It happens when people are serious enough about a goal to organize their entire civilization around achieving it. But what Herzl's plan did not account for, what no strategy can fully account for, is the human cost paid by the people already living on the land where the plan was to be executed. 700,000 Palestinians left in 1948. Their descendants now number between 5 and 6 million, living in refugee camps, in Gaza under blockade, in the West Bank under military occupation, and in the Palestinian diaspora spread across Jordan, Lebanon, and the wider world. They also have a name for what happened to them. They call it the Nakba. They also have a memory that stretches across generations. They also have a connection to a specific land. And they also have a claim that they have never abandoned. The question that the birth of Israel leaves unanswered. The question that every subsequent decade of conflict has failed to resolve is this: when two peoples both have a legitimate historical and emotional connection to the same land, and when the creation of safety and dignity for one came at the direct expense of safety and dignity for the other, how do you build a future that is just for both of them? That question was not answered in 1948. It was not answered in 1967 or 1973 or 1993 at Oslo, or 2000 at Camp David, or 2023 when Gaza became the most densely bombed territory in modern military history. And nobody, not the United Nations, not the United States, not the Arab world, not Israel, and not the Palestinian leadership, has yet produced an answer that both peoples can live with. What we know is this: the birth of Israel was one of the most consequential geopolitical events of the 20th century. It was simultaneously a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph for people who had survived 2,000 years of persecution and returned to reclaim their identity in the land of their ancestors. And a tragedy for a people who had been living on that land for generations and found themselves displaced, stateless, and forgotten by a world that was too exhausted from its own wars to pay attention. History does not move in straight lines. It moves in cycles of power, rising and falling, expanding and contracting, building and destroying. The Roman Empire expelled the Jews from Palestine. The Ottoman Empire gave them refuge. The Crusaders burned them alive. Saladin protected them. The British Empire promised them a homeland. Hitler tried to exterminate them. America recognized their state in 11 minutes. And the Palestinians caught in the middle of every one of these historical forces are still waiting, still in the camps, still at the checkpoints, still watching the settlements expand across the hills of the West Bank. Something bigger is still unfolding. The story of Israel is not finished. And nobody not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not in Gaza, not in Tehran, not in Riyadh knows how it ends.